Welcome, guys. First and foremost, we thank you for being the first Frontend Craftsman meetup ever. We're excited to have you guys here. I'm Jared Moore. I'm the organizer, I guess, officially. That sounds weird to say. And then Russ here on the corner is helping me out with this. We both work here at Weave and noticed that there wasn't a ton of intermediate to advanced level front-end meetups. Like there's a ton of entry-level stuff of here's how to write its do app. But moving beyond that's kind of hard. So that's why we're here. That's why we're starting this. We want to give content that's useful to you guys. We've got a number of speakers lined up, but if you have subjects you're interested in or things you want to hear about, hit us up on Slack, or we're part of Utah Forge. So we'll get a Slack link up here as well. Or on Meetup as well. You can message us. So point number 2, there's a crap ton of pizza. Please eat more. So we're going to be diving in pretty quick. Hopefully people are still trickling in. But yeah, we're going to keep this short and simple and hopefully have a good time tonight. So big thank you to Weave for being our sponsor. They're buying food. They're providing the gifts. It's a great experience here. I love it. If you want to know more, ask me after. This is not a presentation about Weave. So from here on out, I'm going to try and leave that out of it. And then we're going to start off. So state management in React. The hard part is like you see a bunch of code that's out there. You don't know what's good, what's bad, and what's contributing to problems. So to start off, we're going to go over what not to do. And I've seen this quite a bit. So first thing is demo code, right? You go to an NPM repo or some library, you see this on Pluralsight, anywhere else, and it's super common because it's super easy to write. Like I can write a counter component in like 10 lines on CodePen, right? And that's great. The problem with this is it's too simple, right? You can call component.setState, and sure, I can save the value of my counter, and that works great when I have 2 components in my app. But what happens when I have 3 and I need to share it between 2? So the bigger your app gets, the less well this scales. There are times for this, and we'll get into that later tonight. This is probably the most common one I see, is because this is in demo code all over the place, everyone's like, oh, that's how you do it. So this is the first thing not to do. The other thing, thanks, Russ.
Motion activated.
It might be out in the hall.
Oh gosh, yeah, it's all the. Like right now. Oh, I can turn my brightness down. Enjoy the mood lighting.
Yeah, mood lighting. All right. So I don't know how many of you guys have heard of the term God component, one component to rule them all. Being a nerd is my favorite. So, right, what ends up happening is you have setState, like back here, right? And then you're like, oh, I need to share that between 2 components. And so you move it up a level. But then you need to share that with something else over there, so you move it up farther. What ends up happening is at the top of your app, you have one component that's controlling everything. It has to know about all the state and all the other components and who gets what. It gets super complex, and you then have to pass that down your entire tree, right? If you're showing a modal at the very bottom of your tree, and that flag is all the way at the top, every component in that chain has to know about that. So your component props get super messy. It's what's known as prop drilling. And so it just adds a ton of complexity throughout the entire app and more opportunities for bugs. The last one is event pub/sub. So publish, subscribe. This pattern actually isn't a bad thing. There are a lot of valid uses for this pattern. You see this a lot in Angular, right? So if you have a web page and you want to figure out who's using your web page, you're using something like Google Analytics, publishing an event and forgetting about it is a great thing to do. So don't get me wrong. Problem is, looking at code here, right, we're saying, okay, I'm going to publish the login ready event. What happens on login ready? You have no idea. I have no idea. even if I go try and find this code, my best bet is to like try and run a string search across my entire project and hope I find everything that might be listening to this. So that's a problem. And then down below, I've got events like load more button show, load more button disable. These aren't events, these are method calls. I just happen to be firing off an event and calling that method who knows where. So when you're doing these one-off event calls, it's easy to say that this is decoupling. Really all you're doing is adding like unnecessary complexity and opaqueness to your application. Also, Garrett, if you know how to turn on the lights, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
I was wondering what was going on.
They turned off and we can't figure out how to get them back on.
Give me 1 second, I run this board.
Thanks. So moving on to types of state, right? Not all state in our application is the same, right? Some of it's super important, like, am I logged in? And lots of things need to know about that. Other things like, where have I scrolled to on this page before? Might be important for a user experience, but if you forget about it, it's probably fine. So we're gonna start out with local state. And this is something that we usually use setState for. And so oftentimes we have discussions where it's like, don't use local state, right? It's hard to share and it's hard to figure out where it is and update it and prop drilling and all the things that we talked about in the what not to do, right? But there's a very valid use case for this. So some things inherently aren't global. Things like form data. If I'm filling out a new user to create a user in my app, right? And I fill out first name and last name and a phone number and I click save and that goes off to the API and creates a new user and I want to create a new user. I don't want to see what I just typed in again, right? Like all those fields should be blank. If I store that in global state, now I have all this complexity if I have to remember how to reset that and that it's not saved anywhere. If I keep that local to the component, I don't have to worry about all of that. React just takes care of that for me. It's easy because I'm playing to the strength of React. When that component goes away, everything gets forgotten. So there are actually some higher order components, some great libraries that do this for you. Go check out Formic if you haven't. It'll wrap your form and it can tell you about field validation. It will keep a copy of all of your fields for your form. And then when you're done, it will give you a complete object and say, we know this is good data. Thank you, Garrett. We know this is good data. You can now ship it off and treat it like global state. You don't have to go worry about resetting anything. It handles that flow for you. So another great example of when to use local state is highly specific targeted data. So if you're getting a compiled report back from an API, right, it's very specific and you only have one view that can possibly use that because it's so specific. Local state is great. You can't share it, it's too specific. So things like micro interaction data, right? You come to a page for the first time and maybe you have some pretty charts on this report and they all animate in, right? It's a much better user experience. Trying to do that with Redux actions going all the way to some global store is super messy. You're gonna get bugs. It's hard to debug. Keeping it a local state makes way more sense. And then anything with limited scope. So if you want to show or hide a modal, right, based on a button click, you don't have to go put that in Redux. Who's ever showing that modal, who's ever in charge of it, can keep it local. And on a similar note, right, search and filter options. If you've got a list, you've got a search input at the top, you want to type some stuff in. It's not doing any sort of server-side filtering. It's just filtering the data you've already got local. Local states are great. Welcome. So moving on, global state. This is normally what we think about, normally what we talk about when we say state management, right? We did local state for years and years and years in front-end development, and we're like, it's hard to share, it's not structured, leads to tons of bugs. So let's come up with state management libraries. Redux was not the first, but was one of the first really big players in this space created by Dan Abramov. It has a lot of functional programming ideas behind it, which we'll get into more later. Newer to the scene is Mobx. This is great it takes a different approach. So global data store, but where Redux says state should be immutable and don't change it, right? Calculate a new state from your last state. Mobx says, no, state's inherently mutable. We're just going to subscribe to properties. Whenever they change, we'll let you know, but you can just update them like any other object. So if I have an object person and that happens to be a Mobx and I say person.name is equal to Jared, everybody else who cares about that is going to get an update. You don't have to worry about it. It's just built into Mobx. And then recently, React is also a player in this game. So with some of the updates in React 16.8 with the new context API that they've officially blessed, we've had context for a long time, but they've officially said, okay, it's out of beta. You can use it for real now. There are easier ways to do global state using only React. So this covers kind of a middle ground we didn't have before. We'll get into it later, but not all apps need global state management, right? If you're a super small app, it's probably overkill. And React is great for those one-off cases in that in-between stage. The last piece is transient state. This is one that we often forget about, right? So transient meaning like lasting a short time. It's impermanent. This is not data that is vital to your app functioning, usually. Usually we don't do this because it's noisy, right? It's things like scroll position or which products you recently viewed. Now, if you're Amazon, which products you recently viewed is not transient state. You care about that a lot. But if it's just, you're scrolling through your internal page because you're helping a customer and the support tech wants to know what's the last 3 pages he's been on, this kind of transient state, way more usable. So we'll talk about a little bit about this, ways to accomplish that. They have some of those nice usability features in here as well. So we'll get into a few techniques to avoid bugs in each of these different types of state. The first one is limit scope. So you have a state tree, or you have a component tree in React, right? And component B, right here on the left-hand side of that tree, is managing some sort of state and has a bug. Which part of your apps get affected? Which parts can be affected? Right, your only option is A, B, and C. Nothing else possibly has access to that state. And so by limiting scope, you're constraining bugs. You're basically giving a boundary. So the goal here is put state as low as it fits, right? This is another one for a modal, right? I don't know if you guys have ever worked in an app that randomly has modals pop up, but I definitely have, and it's super annoying. And usually that's because something's on global state and it's toggling those flags and opening a modal that's completely unrelated. If you're keeping that state here as to whether that's open or closed, that can't happen. B is not even mounted in the tree. There's no possible way for that modal to open. Like note, right? The root component manages state and has a bug. Which other components are affected? You don't know. It's the whole app. And this is something to keep in mind, right? Because this is essentially what global state is. When you have Redux and you put that Redux store provider right at that top level React DOM render, that's global state. That's just like putting it in your root component. So be careful, because if something goes wrong there, you don't know what's affected. It could be the whole app. Hopefully it's not, but it's possible. So another technique we're going to talk about is single source of truth. And this is about where you store your state. So down in the diagram here, right, you've got a state tree again. You've got two components, A and B, and maybe they both have a users list. What happens when you add a user? You somehow have to add it to both of those lists. You're probably doing something like a pub/sub dot on user added and trying to pass that data around. So you're adding unneeded complexity to your app by doing that. And you're opening yourself up to bugs, because what happens if one of those succeeds and one of them fails? now you have two different user lists that don't have the same data. Maybe it doesn't matter for your app, or maybe it's glaringly obvious to your user that the user isn't, or that to your end user, that one of the other users is in the list on the left-hand side, but doesn't show up in the main view. So that's called the n-update problem, when you have multiple sources of truth and you've got to go update everything. This is super common in databases. And so if you want to learn more about that, there's tons of great literature. But there you go. You didn't know you'd be learning about databases in a front-end meetup. But yeah, single source of truth. It'll save a lot of headache. So how do you fix that? Easiest thing to do is to push that state up, right? If this really is local state, then the parent of A and B can hold that single source of truth, and then the actions flow up and it updates in that source of truth, right? Maybe that gets too complex. You're getting towards that God component, and then you can move it over into something global like Redux, which can help manage this better. This one's a little more subtle. So use a single unique representation for your state. So whenever you duplicate state, something gets more complicated. And how you duplicate that depends, right? So you can go check out these code bends. We'll post the slides later if you want to play around with this more. But basically what's going on here is we've got a circle component, or a circle class. And that circle class knows that it's at a certain X and a certain Y, but a part of our view wants to show polar coordinates too, because why not? And so here our move function now sucks, right? We say, I want to move by delta X and delta Y. And so updating X and Y is really easy. But then updating our R and theta for the polar coordinates all of a sudden sucks, right? What should have been a 2-line function now is 10 lines, and what happens when things go wrong? So we're going to pull that out and say, well, we'll just store it in X and Y, but then we'll have a get polar function on the same circle object. Well, now we have an extra function we didn't need. So because we're storing state in 2 different ways, life sucks. Things are more complicated than they have to be. And so anytime you're duplicating state, this is what you're going to run into. Like you might make circle easy, but then the view components are going to be rough. So something gets more difficult. Which brings us to store state and derive data. That sounds like the same thing, like isn't state just data? And at least for the purposes of my presentation, no, they're not. Because this is alliteration and I like it. And so state, right, is a representation. It's something core to what you're maintaining, right? So if that's a user, maybe that's their ID and their first name and their last name. And data would be something derived from that. So like full name or preferred name, right? Where it's concatenating their first and last name. Don't store that duplicated state, store the underlying parts of it, and then combine them. So for circle, what this would look like was store X and Y. If a user wants to see the polar coordinates, great. That's a view concern now. You don't have to store that. And the only place that's going to show up in your app is where the user wants to view that. It's not going to contaminate everything else. You're not going to get bugs with all the circles. If it's wrong in one tiny spot. So one of the things that you see this super commonly with is selectors in Redux. You don't have to use selectors in Redux. There's a great library called reselect or reselect. If you, yeah, go look it up. But allows you to use this idea of selectors to derive data from your global state. So a great example of this is I have a chat application and I have an array of all the messages that have come in to my application that I show in my view, right? But I also want to like show a list of all the unique users up top that have chatted. So because 99 times out of 100, I want to access all my chat messages, I'm going to store it in Redux as an array. However, when I want to derive that data to show the list of all the users in the conversation, maybe I have an endpoint for that. Maybe it's like Slack and it's set up for 4 users, but probably not. So what I'm going to do is instead, I'm going to take that entire array, and every time I find a new user, I'm going to throw it in an object, right? And I'm going to map that data, right? So that's using a selector to derive data from how I was storing it in state. I store it however is most convenient for the majority of my use cases, but the one-offs I can derive, and I can put that in a function. They call it a selector. Generally, you're going to do this in a pure fashion. So no side effects. Function takes everything that it needs. Hopefully, we're going to have some talks in the future about functional programming. If you're not super comfortable with ideas like pure functions and side effects, we'll talk more about that. Go look it up, though. It's great background if you're not familiar. So last point on this. Derived data should be deterministic. If you do things like fetch data from an API and it fails, what does the view show? You don't know. Maybe it works. Maybe you covered all the use cases. Maybe it throws an error and it takes a path you didn't know was there. So deterministic, hopefully error-free, right? Lodash underscore are great libraries. If you're picking one, go with Lodash. But map, concat, reduce, filter, rather than things like using loops or array.push, right? Those are mutating data. You can't go backwards. So the other thing is separation of concerns. So we went to see Star Wars the other day, and so I came back and wrote this example because we want to show a Star Wars character, right? So we're going to go use the Star Wars API. We're going to go fetch an ID and display their name. So here we're grabbing Luke Skywalker, and we're fancy. We're using hooks, right, from the new React stuff. This code still sucks. Why does it suck? Right, we're using hooks. It's a functional component. So the problem here is we're mixing concerns, right? We're fetching data and doing view logic and trying to do error handling all in the same spot. And so hooks are great, right? Part of the thing that they allow us to do is extract this logic outside the component. So maybe I create a hook, use Star Wars person that I pass an ID in. And then that's outside of my component. I can test my component in isolation. It's only worried about the view logic. My preference is actually to use higher order components for this kind of thing that can be tested even easier in isolation. The hooks, you kind of have to test inside a render cycle or React gets mad at you. Again, topic for another time. So main point here is data logic, view logic, business logic, each have their place in the app. Once you start mixing them, you're gonna get bugs. Last piece is transactional state transitions. That probably sounds like nonsense. But really, this is just Redux, right? So a lot of these things come from database theory, again, right? So transactions allow you to do everything in one block, right? Either the whole thing succeeds or the whole thing fails. So going back to databases, right, we often talk about ACID properties, which is stuff that we love for our data. And Redux gives us a lot of those. So we get the atomicity, data is consistent, and transactions can be isolated. So each of those mean atomic, meaning like the whole thing happens in one operation or it doesn't happen at all, right? You never get half of an action that goes through Redux. Consistent means that if the same actions go through in the same order, you're getting the same result. And isolated means actions don't affect each other. So the only thing that doesn't give us is durability, and that's because if they close their browser, Redux is gone, JavaScript's gone, you don't have anything, right? You can try and write this to the file system, but most browsers won't be very happy with that. So I think 3 of the 4 is as good as we're gonna do, unless you wanna get into really weird stuff like Web SQL, which let's not. So the interesting thing about this is it makes asynchronous, error-prone user interactions deterministic, right? Like you can't control when a user interacts with your application. They could leave it sitting there for 5 hours and then randomly click a button 20 times. And you don't have control over that. But you can fire off those actions and deterministically transform them and your state in the meantime. And so it kind of takes this chaotic world and turns it into a sane control platform. These are also great because they're testable. Going back again to the idea of pure reducers, so no mutations, no side effects, which is great because it means that when we create new state from the current state in action, this gives us time travel, right? I'm sure you've seen these cool demos, right, with the to-do app, and they slide forward and they slide back. The reason they're able to do this is these transactional state transactions. Say that 10 times fast. But to do this, we have to obey the rules of Redux. So we need to use pure reducers, no mutations, no side effects. State should be serializable. That means don't shove functions in there. Don't shove observers or observables in there, right? If you can't JSON stringify it, it's not serializable. And then use middleware properly. I have suggestions for middleware if you want to hear them after the talk, but really whatever you choose is fine. It gives you a way to perform those side effects, things like getting data from your API, things like updating the DOM, setting timers, all those things that are async and error prone, right? Those are side effects. And we want to limit those to our sagas or to your thunks or your observables, whatever you're using, and test them well, because that's where your bugs are going to lie. Here be dragons. So those are the main techniques. Let's move on to a few tips and tricks, and then we'll get on to comments and discussions. Really, at the end of this, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts as to what you're doing, what works well, what doesn't, what kind of problems you're facing. I think that's really going to be where the value of this is. So, okay, finishing up transient state. One of the really cool things about transient state using local storage or session storage is you can persist this across navigation or between sessions if you're using local storage, which means you can use this for things like crash reporting, right? Your app crashes, you're offline, you can't communicate with something. You can serialize your Redux state, whatever you need, shove it in local storage. Next time you come back, you can try and recover from that. This is a much better user experience. Check out React storage hooks or React browser storage to manage this a little bit easier. Disclaimer, I'm currently writing React browser storage, still in beta, so grain of salt. And then use your browser behavior to your advantage, right? You don't have to clear out your sessionStorage every time. The browser just does that for you. So play to the strengths of what you're using. Gotchas here is stale data, right? Saving all your Redux state off to local storage and reading it back is great until you're not supposed to read it back. There's not supposed to be anything there, and there is. Now you've introduced a new bug. So watch out for that. Local storage doesn't always exist. Not all browsers support it, especially not in incognito mode. So something to watch out for. Redux, biggest piece of advice. Not every app needs Redux. We talk about Redux so much, and oh, we use React and Redux, right? Like you create a React app, and the first thing you do is install Redux, and that might not be the best thing to do, right? If you have a huge app and you really need that global state management, go for it. If you can get away with less, your life will probably be easier. If it's an internal help page, you probably don't need it. Not all state belongs in Redux. We already talked about that a lot, right? Like push state as low as it goes. That'll make your life easier. You try and do form state in Redux, you're gonna hate life. Keep it simple. Really, predictability and simplicity are usually more important than saving a few lines of code. The dev who comes back 6 months later to fix your code, keep in mind that dev might be you and you don't remember what you did. They do that all the time. Is gonna thank you if your code is easy to read and you don't have to dig through 10 pages of docs to figure out what the heck you did. Favor composition over generation, right? So sometimes with Redux, there's tons of boilerplate code. And it's really easy to be like, I'm gonna dynamically generate all my actions and all the handlers because I do the same thing in 99% of them. You can do that, but you're not gonna like it when you have to try and debug that and you have magic functions that are handling things that aren't anywhere in your source code. So personally, I hate black magic. which is what generation is most of the time. And so if you do something like composition, right, you use a single handler that you reuse. When you step in, you have discrete code that you're going to. Things like Redux actions is a great library if you haven't checked it out. Plop can help with templating so that creating all this boilerplate isn't overwhelming. And then take advantage of Pareto's principle. So you may have heard of this called the 80-20 rule, right? Whatever you're doing, like 20% of the time, should get you 80% of the benefit.
I'm not sure if you hear about the React Redux starter kit. It's built by one of the maintainers of Redux, and it's solving most of the boilerplate for that part. It's creating your actions for you. It's creating your store and stuff. So it's really
Redux starter kit?
Yeah, Redux starter kit.
It's a great tip. I'll have to check it out. Thank you. So yeah, like if you access your data the same way 80% of the time, going back to the chat example, right? Like keep all your chat messages in an array. It makes way more sense. If there's another 20% that doesn't fit, don't duplicate that state, derive it. That's fine. Whatever you're doing most of the time, optimize for that. React context. I promised we'd get back to this, and I didn't forget. So sometimes you have little pieces of data that you share all over your app, and they don't really fit anywhere. You can put them in global state, sure, right? But it's kind of weird to put like your UI theme in your Redux. Something just feels wrong about that. You can do this with auth data too, right? Like maybe you log in and every 5th component needs to know the user's token or something. You might be doing something weird if you're doing that, but it's now possible, right? So you can create a context and you put a provider at the root of your app, and whoever wants to use it, you can just say use context. Actually, with hooks, you don't even have to use the provider anymore. You can just say use context. And your component's going to get that global state. Components can update that context. So for things like settings, this is awesome. Because all you have to do is say use settings, and you get all your settings. If you have a settings page that can update that, that's great. It can still be in charge of that while everything else can still read from it. And that's all I got. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thoughts, problems you're facing, solutions that you've tried that worked really well.
Just on that last slide.
Yeah.
You said about context. You're saying you don't have to put use context inside of the provider? Or what did you say?
Yeah.
So it like React in this case.
So yeah, okay.
Global context or something?
Clarification, right? With the old context API, you use providers and consumers. Okay, the old new context, right? React's gone through like 4 stages of this. The most recent one, you call react.createContext. That context has a provider and a consumer component on it. Usually you would wrap the provider somewhere near the top level of your app, same as you would for like your Redux store. Then down below, whenever you want to use it, you can say use context, or then you can use the consumer, and it will provide you those values. So it gives you the same thing. It's a little bit clunky. There's HOCs that will do this for you. You can also do like a render props kind of pattern. So you can say like context.consumer and give it a function that takes those values and returns some UI. That's kind of clunky. With the new hooks, with use context, you don't need the provider. You pass in the full object, and it'll give it to you.
But I think you will need a provider if you are updating that data, right?
Yeah, so you can use this, the use context, and it gives you back.
But how you are updating your data on the top level. Right? Just saying, right now you're just, every time that you put theme, you're gonna receive a color white and background color white. Why haven't you need to update that data?
So this theme there on the first line is actually a context object. So the object that's getting passed into create context is just the default values. That object has everything it needs to know how to update and notify everybody. So using the context, you can then go in, there's methods and things you can update. At least as far as I'm aware. I did go look this up, but my memory is not perfect. So
this might be more laziness on my part, but so with Redux, oftentimes you will create your store, put it at the root of your app,
Mhm.
and then just start stuffing things in there. And then when you hook up your store, you're like, okay, throw all my reducers in there, which starts off easy enough. You have like 3 reducers. Then your project gets bigger. Now you got like 15 to 20 reducers going in there.
Yep.
I imagine there is a cost for that because is it my understanding that Redux, like has a message that gets dispatched. It's got to hit every one of those reducers until it hits the one that, well, I think it hits every single one anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah, but there's some optimizations that make that a little faster.
I mean, each reducer is going to say like, do I know about this action? No, I don't. And then it just keeps going down the line. Like, at what point does it make sense to like start having multiple provider routes? Is that a thing? Do people do that? Like, how do you optimize something like that?
So in Redux, no. Redux is part of a bigger picture called the Flux architecture that had multiple stores, and you could say, this is a store for this part of the app. That's a store for that part of the app. And you would interact with these actions to different stores. And to simplify that, the Redux architecture came out and says, no, we just have one store. Unless you're building a super high performance application, usually it's not an issue. You have to be storing a lot of data before that memory conversion becomes super problematic. You can get there, don't get me wrong.
Okay.
You can definitely get there, but for most applications, the benefit to the consistency and simplicity of your code outweighs the minor performance that you take.
I know that the new release of React Redux has the ability to pass a context to the connected components. So you have your connected high order component that you made map state to browse, dispatch, and then a context. And that one, in that way, you can use multiple stores at the very, very top. So you could use like create context similar like this one and pass one store, create context, pass the other store. And then in your components, you can select which store you are gonna need. I'm not really familiar with that. I haven't played with that, but I know that there is a.
That's interesting because then you probably have to like say, okay, now I care about this store, and within this store, I need this piece of data, which is great until you need to communicate between stores.
Yeah, just slightly swimming upstream there.
Yeah.
Some people started to refactor their reducers too, to not use switch statements and to use object lookup instead, where your reducer actually returns an object, and then your action type can look up on that object by key, which is way faster than trying to sort through a switch statement or whatever. There's more complexity and some other moving parts with that or whatever, but if you end up with 15 reducers, that might be 1,500 messages or whatever, right? That might be the time where those item lookups could increase performance and stuff like that.
I think, now that I hear you guys say this, I think our performance is probably less about that, more around probably playing around with the component will update or something. Okay.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. Usually the work that your UI framework is doing with figuring out the DOM diffs and updating the DOM is super heavy. Right. So unless you have that super fine-tuned, you're usually not going to see
your rendering
the
is
React
usually
issues.
where the performance problems are.
Premature optimization.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, this can be a general question to everyone, but what kind of state management are you using on your team, and have hooks changed the way that you guys look at it at all?
So they did a little bit. I guess first part of your question, we use a mix. We use Redux for the global app, which is great. A lot of stuff that we're doing specific to our product, at least the team that I'm on, is very specialized reports and custom data. And so a lot of that gets handled with Apollo through GraphQL because they're requesting very specific metrics for a specific time range, and those have to be aggregated on the server. And so it gets stored in local state right at the visualization level, and the pages can use auth data or input data to tell those components what data they should fetch.
One thing with Apollo, I'm a huge fan of Apollo. So a lot of the tips that like we went over, like normalizing your data and like deriving data, like Apollo will do that for you. Because like based on how like typed things are, like it does a lot of the normalization. Like if you ever go look at your Apollo store, like you'll see like your data just like segmented because it like can normalize it at another level, depending on how your API looks. But like and like the loading state, your error state, like you get all those states. Like Jared's saying, like that state isn't stored in Redux because a lot of times like you use Redux and you have a reducer, and in that you say, okay, here's my data, is loading, error, and like I can't tell you how many times we have that in our freaking code, and it drives me nuts. But it's like because you're storing this thing and like loading shouldn't really be at that global level. It's like at a component. You go to a different component. Okay, you don't care about that data anymore, and so like Apollo does that too. So like they're actually working on stuff too where you can actually like interact with local storage through GraphQL. You can actually create like a Redux store without using GraphQL endpoint and store it in Apollo and interact with your data through GraphQL. Like it's insane what they're doing. So like I would recommend to everybody check Apollo out and just mess with it, because even if you're not using GraphQL servers, you can still utilize that like type safety that you get, and it's freaking awesome. So
That's actually an awesome point as well. That here in my slides, keep in mind, I have Apollo as local state because for the majority of use cases and what's on their docs, that's what it's for. Under the hood, it actually has a lot of benefits of global state, right? If you're fetching the same objects in two disparate components, it actually has a cache underneath the hood, and it will give you cache data. And you can control that on a per component level. So it's kind of a hybrid. So especially with some of the advanced use cases, keep that in mind. You kind of get both. Questions, comments? Awesome. Thanks for being here. I'd love to hear from you guys about what you thought about the presentation, ideas for future presentations, what would be useful, and we hope we see you next month. Thanks, guys.